Hello, my curious archaeogastronomers. This is the Delicious Legacy Podcast. And I'm your host, Thom. Welcome back to another archaeogastronomical adventure. And I'm so glad that you are joining me again this week, because I've got a part 2 of a compendium of ancient Greek food. Remember, a few months ago, I think it was early June, I released an episode about some unusual and interesting foods from the ancient Greek world. So today I thought I'll revisit some other ingredients of the ancient Greek table and kitchen and talk about them. I found some interesting stuff that led me down to some not too deep rabbit holes, but nevertheless I was kind of going into different areas and trying to find what is similar today, what happened, what we call them today, some names and ingredients and so on. Anyway, I will let you enjoy this episode right now, and I'll be back at the end for some news and updates, and of course some recommendations for what to listen or read this week coming up. The first thing in my list was honey, which of course I did a whole episode about it a couple of years ago, and the history of honey in the world in general. But this time I had a very specific thing that I wanted to check, and that was the reputation of the Athenian honey, the honey from Attica, and specifically from the mountain just outside Attica, Hymettus, which was famous all over the ancient Greek and Roman world, and people sought after that honey. So honey from Mountain Hymettus, which is nowadays a sad imitation, a pale imitation of its old glorious self. There's a lot of hollowed out areas from marble quarries and other industries that left their marks on the mountain itself. And obviously scars from fires over the years, forest fires and wildfires that ravage Attica, Athens, and Greece in general. If we go roughly 500 years ago, the German traveller Reinhold Lubenow wrote that the longevity of Athenians is due to 4 factors, including the honey of Hymettus. That was on his book Athens of 1587. Influenced by ancient reports, but also trusting their taste criteria, European travellers, consuls, and the first tourists, let's say, of the modern world, have left us enthusiastic reviews of honey from Attica. The French consul general Louis-Auguste Félix de Beaujeu, for example, wrote in 1797 that Attica honey had retained its ancient reputation. 3,000 beehives were kept in the 4 monasteries of Hymettus. Another 6,200 beehives were kept by the villagers of Attica. Attica, generally the area that surrounds Athens. The yield of each hive was 30 liters of honey and 2 liters of wax. Attica honey was considered the finest honey in the world, in the known ancient world. It was also the most expensive. In Roman times, only the wealthy ordered it, and even reported that a freed slave in Rome brought bees from Attica to the gardens of his villa to make honey for him. There are references to honey as a medicine in papyri documents, and a doctor in ancient Egypt recommends to a patient with an eye problem to use an extremely expensive imported product to apply to his eyes, Attic honey. It was therefore an export product of Athenians, well known around the ancient world, and fragments of ancient beehives are discovered everywhere in Attica, and there is the view that honey was produced even within the city of Athens, and some archaeologists seem to agree with this view, because so many beehives were found which cannot be justified by use only in honey production workshops. In fact, Between the 6th and 7th centuries BCE, Solon, the great Athenian statesman, enacted for the first time in recorded history legislation concerning the practice of beekeeping, setting conditions regarding the distance between apiaries, which had to be at least 300 feet. So developed was beekeeping in Attica so many thousand years ago that its practice was legislated. Honey from the Mt Hymettus was the top honey of the ancient world thanks to its rich flora of thyme and savory and shades and St. John wort, asphodels, autumn heather amongst many, and its climate. This combination of soil, flora and climate, it was alleged that is not found elsewhere in the world. And this is why honeys from similar areas across the Mediterranean, such as islands and the Aegean, were excellent, but characterized as similar to Attica without having its level. This is the famous, to this day, thyme honey of Attica. Before the Roman Empire, that honey was used to add cakes to make them sweeter. And under the Roman Empire and influence, honey was a commonplace of the gastronomy of Rome itself, being one of the two classic ingredients for balsam. Another interesting ingredient of the ancient Greek world was juniper, from a group of aromatic evergreen trees and shrubs, the genus of Juniperus. And the general names of the group in Greek are kedros, and particularly to ancient Greeks, when these berries, the juniper berries, were dried, resembled peppercorns and were used like pepper as a spice. There are ancient medicinal texts that give similar medicinal properties to them also. And according to the recipe given by Plutarch, 2 kinds of juniper berry were used in the Egyptian purge kifi. In Greek, the tree was called arkephthos, and the berry arkephthis and kedrion. So this kedros is also what we call cedar tree, and the cedar sap was particularly used as a preservative and embalming in Egypt. It was also used as a contraceptive applied to the male member before, the act. The Greeks used the berries in many of the Olympic events because of their belief that the berries increased physical stamina in the athletes. Pliny the Elder informs us that expensive black pepper imported from India was adulterated with juniper berries, which take its taste. Moving on to something more common and simple, let's talk about the leek, which was a typical garden vegetable in the early Eastern Mediterranean. The Greek term for garden plot or a garden bed is prasia, which literally means leek bed. Similarly, the ancient Egyptian term for leek also means vegetables in general. Leeks, as it happens to this day, were planted in the summer and harvested in mid to late winter, which is an unusual but useful timetable, which helps to explain the apparent vapid proverb recorded by Cato: if you plant leeks every year, you will have leeks to pull every year. My guess is that he didn't like them. Leeks also gave their name in Greek and Latin to the color prasinos, green, which for many centuries was the livery of one of the 2 teams of charioteers at the Roman circus. Leeks were an important vegetables and aromatic in both Greek and Roman cuisine, called for over 60 times in the recipes of Apicius. They spread northwards in cultivation in Roman times. Leek seeds are found in excavations of sites in Roman Gaul, Britain and Germany, and in all 3 regions the leek, once introduced, continued to be grown in later times. They were also valued as a medicinal plant. In particular, they were supposed to add brilliance to the voice, which is why the Emperor Nero ate cutting leeks and nothing else on certain prescribed days each month. 2 cultivated varieties were recognized: the cutting leek, in Greek karton, and the headed leek, kephaloton, the latter rightly said by Athenaeus to be more juicy and corresponds to the modern Middle Eastern varieties which have more distinct bulb. Another common salad vegetable for the Greeks was lettuce, and in Greece and Rome they were familiar with it in the classical period, but we don't have any evidence in prehistory being used as such. And amongst the hors d'oeuvres that were eaten, the starters and so on, lettuce was one of them, and it was said to float in the stomach and thus to be indigestible if eaten towards the end of the meal. Anthimus, the physician of the late 5th century AD, wisely advised that it must be eaten when freshly gathered. And lettuce apparently was regarded as aphrodisiac in Egypt, but in Greek and Roman medicine, lettuce was said to cause bodily weakness, hence it was considered anti-aphrodisiac. And there is a saying, don't serve me thridakine. Don't serve me thridakine at table, woman, or you will have yourself to blame. In a lettuce bed, they say, once upon a time the dead Adonis was laid to rest by Aphrodite, so it is good for corpses. The milky sap of lettuce had a real sedative effect in the ancient world, though it is very weak today in the modern cultivated varieties compared to wild species. And lettuce was sometimes eaten with rocket, which was an aphrodisiac, so the two salad vegetables thus counterbalanced one another, as Pliny explains. Plutarch discussed why it was that women do not eat the heart of the lettuce, but the discussion does not survive. Ancient gastronomes thought well worth the trouble of someone catching them, and that was the Moray eel, one of the larger Mediterranean fish, Moarina helena. They thought of them as nourishing as eels and easiest to pick at when cold, according to a speaker in Plautus Persa. Apparently they were good in the Atlantic around Cadiz, the modern day of Cadiz, and another good place to catch them was off Rhegium at the southern extremity of Italy, where they grew to great size apparently, basked on the sea surface and were called plotae in Greek. Roman lovers of luxury foods kept Moray eels in fish ponds, but separately from other fish, which they were fierce enough to kill. Vidius Pollio was said to punish slaves by feeding them to his morays. This may be an abridgment of the truth, but need not to be falsification, since the bite of a moray will often fester and can therefore kill. The Emperor Augustus, present on the occasion of one such execution, intervened to reprieve the victim. Crassus wept as bitterly for a pet moray as Domitian wept for his 3 wives, in a story told by Plutarch. The usual Greek name for the Moray eel, Moarina helena, was Smyrna or Myrena. The word was also used, like in English we use the word shark, as a term of abuse. Oysters also were eaten, quite rightly in my opinion, in the ancient Greek table. These little bivalve shellfish were an article of food in the Mediterranean coast since prehistoric times. Heaps of oyster shells were found by Heinrich Schliemann, famed German archaeologist, in his excavations at Mycenae. The classical Hellespont was rich in oysters, the city of Abydos in particular, according to Archestratus. And Latin poets later on agree as well, and they added Cyzicus and Chalcedon, opposite of Byzantium, to the city of Abydos. Also, in Roman times, an oyster geography became established. According to Xenocrates, they were good at the mouth of the Nile, at Ephesus near the mouth of the Cayster, at Brindisium, Taraco, Narbo, and in the Lucrine Lake, at Lefkas, at Actium, and at the Syrtes Gulfs. At almost the same date, Pliny gives another list, crediting it to Mucianus, a Roman consular who wrote enthusiastically of his eastern posting. The oysters of Cyzicus are bigger than the Lucrine, sweeter than the British, smoother than the Medullan, sharper than the Ephesian, fuller than those of Lucca, drier than the Coryphantene, more tender than the Histrian, whiter than the Circean. Pliny, incidentally, attributes the fame of the Lucrine oysters to Sergius Orata. Roughly 300 years later, Ausonius, in a verse survey, claims knowledge of several of these kinds and adds them to others, mainly from Gaul, modern-day France. The coast near Narbo was still producing them. Oysters also came from Massalia, Marseille, and from the beds of the Atlantic coast, which nowadays produces the oysters of Marennes. His favorite, however, came from the closest at hand. They were the Modullan, from the peninsula now known as Medoc, close to his hometown of Bourdigala, which is Bordeaux, and they had graced imperial tables ever since. The oysters of Britain, which must have been very new to Rome in Mucianus' time, came from the Kent coast, as they do now. They were associated with the Roman harbour of Rutupiae. Those of the Lucrine lake were famed, or at least encouraged, and supplied the demand for fine seafood at the Roman holiday resort of Baiae. Pliny notes that the best were found to be the Brundisian oysters, transported across the Apennines, and since that was a mountain range in Italy, at high cost, and fattened in the Lucrine lake. Oysters were a rich man's dish. Lucrine oysters were a patron's dish in Martial's satirical epigram, and wealth was demonstrated by the consumption of large numbers of them. 100, says Juvenal. Seneca gave up oysters and mushrooms as unnecessary luxuries, a symbol of the vegetarianism and asceticism he toyed with. Epicharmus says that oysters are hard to open but easy to eat. They have the softest flesh of any shellfish, according to Galen, but some, including the unsmiling Seneca, declare them indigestible. The oyster was also eaten raw in the ancient world too, but this was advisable only if the oysters were good and fresh. Otherwise, they were no better than poison, says Anthimus. Galen agrees that oysters were sometimes eaten raw, sometimes fried in a skillet. The Baian casserole of Apicius, in which minced oysters mingled with mussels and sea urchins, was indeed a rich man's dish. The fact that British oysters were available in Rome shows that they were preserved, presumably in brine, in barrels or earthenware jars and aphorae, for dispatch on the long journey from the Channel coast. That fresh British oysters were available at Rome is impossible, though one famous cook found a way of packing fresh oysters to send over a shorter distance from the Syrian coast to the Emperor Trajan's camp while he was on a campaign in Mesopotamia, according to Athenaeus. The cookbook of Apicius gives us instructions of making oysters last, in this way by washing them and then containing them with vinegar. You are listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Thom. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. Something like a pasta, something like different types of pasta was available in the ancient Greek world. Of course, pasta is not a new invention. It was not imported by Marco Polo to Italy from China. Some sort and form existed in Italy and in Greece before that. Pressed shaped cakes of flour and water existed in the classical Greek world. And three names are known: Itria, which also in Aramaic is Itria, and was by later classical times a pasta-like product made from wheat flour cooked by boiling and generally forming part of a sweet dish. It was one of the ingredients of libum, as briefly described in Athenaeus, and it was shaped. The word plasmata, shapes, used by Hesychius in describing it. One of its shapes may already have been that of vermicelli. Then there was laganon, which by later classical times was a flat pasta-like product. In earlier contexts, the word is likened to unleavened bread or pancake. This is the pasta Horace ate with leeks and chickpeas, and laganon might be eaten with oil. It might also be fried or cooked in chicken broth. Artolaganon, presumably a variant, incorporated a little pastry wine, pepper and milk. Artolaganon, something like that, survives in modern Italian dialects as a word. Finally, we have the Greek makaria, which was a dish made of soup and barley meal, and not pasta per se, in the classical times. The name makaria, though, however, is the origin of the Italian macaroni. In classical Greece, also pear, the fruit, was eaten. The cultivated pear was recognized to be a relative of the native wild pear, but not a direct offshoot. It is among the typical orchard fruits listed in Odysseus' description of the gardens of Alcinous in the Odyssey. In a play by Alexis, the comedic writer in Athens, we know that pears were served as desserts in symposia in classical Athens. Did you ever see pears served in water to men while they were drinking? Lots of times, obviously. Doesn't each of the men always look for the ripest of the floating pears for himself and pick that? Of course they do. From Roman sources, we know other ways which pears were used. They could be cooked with wine and water to make a kind of pulmentarium, as Pliny describes it. They were conserved in grape syrup and also dried for the use over the winter, an important point because pears are at their peak of ripeness only for a short time and must be conserved in some way if they're not to be wasted. By late Roman times, perry, an alcoholic drink analogous to cider, and pear vinegar and pear liquamen were all manufactured, as shown by Palladius. And pear liquamen was served as a vegetarian alternative to garum. Over the years and centuries, numerous varieties were developed, especially in the Roman period. Among the most frequently named are the Crustuminum, recorded in Aramaic and Roman sources, and apparently linked with the town of Crustumeria near Rome. The Mnea, recorded by Galen, which could be sliced into rings and dried for use in winter and spring. And the Volaemma, supposed to be large enough to fill the hand, one of those good for conserving in grape syrup, according to Cato. Wild pears of Greece, from the genus Pyrrhus spinosa, were being collected at the Frankthy cave by 9000 BCE. And we have wild pear in Greece, and which is a spiny tree and was used for a defensive hedge as well. And the fruit is small and astringent. And pulmentarium is something like a relish, anything that can be eaten with bread. So it could be a variety of foodstuffs, both sweet and savory options. And it was very much something that was eaten a lot in the ancient Roman tavernas and fast food places. Plum was another tree fruit which was very popular. And it has various species grow wild in Western Europe and also all across the temperate zone to China. The cultivated plum of Europe descends from a wild species of southeastern Europe and southwestern Asia. It is not known where domestication took place exactly, but as with several other fruits, it could have been in Anatolia in the late prehistoric period. A divergent subspecies, the bulas, gave rise to the modern group of cultivated varieties known as damsons. These nowadays are favored in Northern Europe and may be descendants of the type known in Roman time as Damascinum, the Damascus plum, which was at the time typical of Syria. In Central and Southern Europe, the usual wild plum is the sloe. Sour as it is, it was being gathered as human food in Southern Europe by 7000 BCE and remained familiar in classical times as a food gathered from the wild. Greeks had many names for plums. Kokimelon, perhaps the domestic plum, Prumnon, perhaps the bulas plum, Damascenon, the damson, and Brabylon, the sloe. They were also beginning to develop larger, sweeter varieties, and we can contrast the wreath of plums mentioned by Hipponax with the engaging simile offered by Alexis 2 centuries later. Did you ever see a cooked calf's stomach or a boiled stuffed spleen or a basket of fried plums? That's what his face looks like. Romans, by the time of Pliny, had got a good deal further with plum cultivation. They had many varieties, several varieties in fact, of plums. Quince, Cydonia vulgaris, is a typical orchard fruit of the southern Europe. Quinces are not always distinguished from apples in classical Greek texts. Sometimes they're both equally called melon. The two fruits look superficially similar, but apples are shiny, and quinces, on the other hand, look a little dusty. They suggested both to Aristophanes and to Aristaenetus a comparison with young women's breasts. While many varieties of apples can be eaten fresh, quinces always need to be boiled or baked, as Anthimus rightly says. The city of Kydonia, modern-day Hania, in western Crete, was famous as the place where quinces came from. In Greece, the quince is Kydonian melon, literally Kydonian apple. This is no legendary association. Quince orchards and nurseries of Roman date have been identified in the fields around Hania. The earliest history of the quince is unknown. Prehistoric archaeologists have found no signs of it. Apparently, it's not mentioned in the Homeric epics, where apples are conventionally shiny-fruited. Quinces can be distinguished in archaic Greek lyric poetry and in later written sources, both Greek and Latin, of all kinds. Their characteristic slightly irregular bulges are often to be identified in classical sculpture. In ancient times, two varieties of quince were always recognized, though perhaps not always the same two. The larger, sweeter, and less astringent were called struthion by the Greeks in Asia, according to Galen. This name was familiar in early Greek. The other variety had been distinguished from it as Chthonion melon. In Greece, Chthonium or Cotoneum in Latin. By Galen's time, there was a newer and even sweeter variety, which was known as honey apple, Melimilon. This latter variety became sufficiently popular to transmit its variety name to the whole species in modern Spanish, Marmelo. The other name, Latin Cotoneum, survives in French. Quinces could be boiled with wine and water to make kind of pulmentarium, as we said, which is a kind of relish, savory usually, but also fruity. And there are many recipes and instructions for conserving them so as to retain their food value through the winter, whether whole or cooked down. They combined particularly well with honey. Recipes can be found for Chthonion and honey, so quince in honey, and Chthonion in fat. A more homogenized product, a distant ancestor of the modern quince marmalade or quince cheese, was Chthoniomeli, mentioned by Columella, and the recipe for this is supplied by Dioscurides. A fermented drink, essentially a fruit wine, was made from this and was known in Greek as hydromelon. There is also a recipe for steeping quinces in grape wine to make what was known in Greek as chthonites inos, quince wine and apple wine. Finally, there is a recipe for a kind of quince jam known as chthonites, a preserve with the consistency of honey, according to Palladius, and one for a quince syrup or cordial to Apochthonion melon from Orivasius. All these conserves had medicinal use, and generally it is in medical sources that these recipes are found. Terebinth, or turpentine tree, the Pistacia atlantica, it was a widespread wild tree and still is, whose extent ranges from the Maghreb eastwards to the Hindu Kush. And this was a species which spread westwards with the pistachio. In Hellenistic times and after, because it provided, and still does actually, rootstocks on which the pistachio may be grafted. All terebinths, big, slow-growing trees, have often served as landmarks in the Near East. One near Hebron was said to have grown there since the creation of the world. According to Xenophon, Ctesias and Polyneius, the tiny, oil-rich fruits of the terebinth can be eaten and are sometimes pressed for oil, as they were in the Achaemenid Persia. Famously, they were a major item in the traditional diet of young Persians. They cured headaches and were mildly laxative and aphrodisiac, according to Pliny and to Dioscurides. Fruits of the related shrubby trees of Pistacia terebinthus and Pistacia lentiscus have had similar uses. Such fruits are frequently reported from archaeological sites in the region from Mesolithic times onwards, so circa 10,000 BCE to 7,000 BCE. The lentisk fruited 3 times a year, warning the farmer of the dates on which 3 different groups of crops were to be grown, according to Theophrastus. Palladius gives instructions of making lentisk oil. Terebinth resin comes mainly from the Pistacia atlantica. The other 2 species produce little resin, except the trees of the Lentiscus var Chia, which gives us the mastic from the Chios island in Greece. The ancient method of tapping is described by Pliny. The resulting resin was chewed as a gum, and we've seen that in our episode about masticha, and it was used in perfumes. It served to give a waterproof inner surface to the dolium, earthenware vat in which wine would mature. It was sometimes added to wine itself to stabilize it, and for flavor. Nearly half a ton of terebinth resin went down in a shipwreck dated from approximately 1200 BCE, excavated off the Turkish coast at Uluburun. The terebinth tree and its fruit are temerinthos in Greek, and the lentil tree schinos, and the terebinth resin may have been actually found in linear bead tablets as well. You are listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. Finally, tuna and bonito were really, really popular fishes from the ancient Greek world. Because of their patterns of migration, tuna and bonito can be caught in large numbers and quite predictably at certain times of the year. The value of the potential catch makes elaborate preparations worthwhile. Hence, along certain coasts, such as the west coast of Italy and Sicily and Sardinia, watchtowers called Thynoscopia were built to give warning of the approach of the migratory shoal, and strong nets were built out into the sea to channel and trap the fish. These are techniques and ways of fishing tuna that survives to this day, miraculously. Their strength and desperation is such at the conclusion of the hunt when the fish were speared with tridents and was a bloody business. A process that is described by Manilius, Aelian, Philostratus and Oppian, and Strabo, speaking in some detail of the migration of bonito and tuna. And he says, the Palamides originate in the marshes of Myotis, which is today's Sea of Azov. Getting a little bigger, they escape through its mouth, the Straits of Kerch, in shoals, and are swept along the Asian coast of Trapezus and Pharnakia. That is where the hunting of them begins, though it is not a major activity because they have not yet reached full size. As they pass Sinope, they are riper for catching and for salting. When they have reached the Chianae and enter the strait, a certain white rock on the Chalcedonian side so frightens them that they cross to the opposite side, and there the current takes them, and the geography at that point is such as to steer the current towards Byzantium and its horn, and so they are naturally driven there, providing the Byzantines and the Roman people with a considerable income. It is difficult today, and it was even more difficult back in ancient times, when no human could travel as fast as the tuna, to determine how far any particular shoal might migrate. Aristotle believed in a single long migration in which the fish travelled from the Black Sea all the way to Atlantic and back. Obviously, we know today that something like that is not happening. However, ancient observations and deductions regarding shorter migrations through the Black Sea and the Bosporus or through the Straits of Gibraltar are generally accurate, and various species in the tuna and bonito family are not always distinguished in everyday language, since what is important to the fishermen and cooks is not the species but the size, which depends chiefly on the age of the fish. In general, classical Greek texts have most to say about the bonito, the mainstay of fishery in Byzantium, where excellent salted bonito, called tarichos choreon, was prepared. Later, more is heard about the tuna of the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic, and about the fine salted tuna that was prepared in Gades, modern-day Cadiz, and was exported to Italy and Greece. Sicily and Tarentum were also sources of salted tuna or bonito. In Antipolis, according to Martial, muria or fish brine was made from the tuna, and it was good. Indeed, without full knowledge of the migrations, ancient observers simply had insufficient information to distinguish between the differences of species and the different age. According to Sostratus, whose views agree to some extent with several other authors, there were essentially one species, his generic term is palamis, of which tuna is the smallest form, thynos the next, orkinos the next, ketos the biggest of all. And Pliny makes the sequence even more complicated, inserting pelamis and apokletus as additional growth stages. Because of the migration patterns, few Greeks or Romans tasted fresh, unless they were at the right place at the right time. The fresh meat of the largest specimens is in fact hard to eat, according to Galen of course, unless prepared in the right way, perhaps with a sauce called mitotos, as we are told by early Greek poet Hipponax and Ananius, perhaps following the recipe on Archestratus for amia, which we will see below, perhaps preferring the head as suggested by Alexis. The best bit of the tuna or bonito, sufficiently juicy or oily to be extremely palatable, was the underbelly cut, hypogastrion, known to Romans as abdomen and similarly in modern Italian as ventresco. There was also the tail cut, ureon, and the shoulder, aphien, and perhaps clidion, a specialty of Cadiz, but drier and not so digestible. From the biggest tuna came the oily meat, disliked by Aristotle and Martial, and that was conserved under the name melandria. The commonest of the species that migrate from the Black Sea to the Aegean has the Greek name Amia, which is the full-grown Bonito, and migrates to the Aegean in the autumn and back in the spring, though it's also found elsewhere and is now called in full Atlantic Bonito. It was at its best in autumn, which, while en route, it was thought to be bought at Byzantium and along the Hellespont, as Archestratus advises us. And his recipe, which we've seen before, goes like this. Use fig leaves and season with oregano, but not very much of it. No cheese, no nonsense. Just do it up nicely in a fig leaves, fastened with a string. Then hide it under the hot ashes. Keep a watch on the time when it will be baked, and don't overcook it. Greek Avlopias probably was the albacore tuna. It was caught off the Lipari Islands, and it was a fish well worth eating. Buy the head, said Archestratus, in summer, and serve it with a sauce. Roast the belly meat on a spit, and the salted tuna from Gadis, already known to Epiphanes, emerges into the fuller light of history in the writings of Aristotle, in whose time the business was operated by the Phoenicians, and the barrels of salted tuna were exported to Carthage. Hicesius, not long afterwards, comments the Gadirikon, the tuna of Gadis, with particular praise for the dietary qualities of the salters of it. Galen says that this Iberian-Spanish supply of salted tuna is second only in quality to Byzantium. Okay, and that's it. That's the end of part 2 of our Compendium of Ancient Greek Food. Okay, for this week's recommendations, I want to tell you about the article by Ruby Tandoh at the New Yorker magazine, Inside the World of the Great British Bake Off, which is a very nice, interesting article about the series. A Substack 3-part story on how biodiversity gave early humans in South Africa the tools to survive extinction, and we'll leave a link in the show notes. And the article at the Londoner, An Immovable Feast, how Dalston fishmongers took the city of London. And I just want to thank all of you for listening to this little podcast of mine. We are on the top 2% of podcasts globally, which is great and amazing. But there are so many podcasts out there. And I would love if you all leave a rating and a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Pocket Casts and so on. And basically make the podcast grow this way a little bit more organically, basically. With this rating and review, the podcast can go to other people's feeds and get shared and spread this way. And of course, I would like to thank all my Patreon backers and subscribers there. Your support and your help really means a lot to me. And if you want to ask any questions, or you have any suggestions or points that you want to make, please get in touch at the Delicious Legacy Podcast at gmail.com, all one word. And of course on Blue Sky or Instagram or on Patreon if you are a member there. And of course everyone is welcome to ask me anything, and I'm eagerly awaiting your comments, as I do believe I genuinely learn a lot from people's new ideas and suggestions and the way they think about things. So please, get in touch. Finally, this podcast cannot exist without your generous support, so you can support the podcast at ko-fi.com with one-off donations or with monthly subscription, and basically you can help me work more on the podcast and researching, writing, producing, editing and mixing. I do hope you enjoy this podcast. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcast from, and share it with some friends and family and colleagues, or in a WhatsApp group or in a Facebook page. And the podcasts are all about food and history and traditions and how all relate to our modern day and age. And that's it for this week, my hungry archaeogastronomers. Thanks for listening. Please, if you haven't done already, get your tickets for the Serve It Forth Food History Festival on the 18th of October, which is happening online. I'll leave details on the show notes, and yeah, it's going to be one day of fun, of food, and of history. Thanks. See you again next week with another archaeogastronomical adventure. Bye!